Hi, long range hunting. Today I want to cover a quick topic which has to do with some myths about shooting at long range and deer moving. Now, something I hear all the time, it's hunting season, seasons are just starting, people are busting out their rifles, people are posting their kills, and they're getting a lot of grief, and one of the most common things I hear is it's unethical. That deer could take a step after you break the shot, and the incredible flight time, it could go 10 feet, which is an absolute load. It's just somebody without any understanding trying to make a hunter look bad. Because in reality, yes, do deer step? Yes. Do elk step? Yes. Do they step and go 10 feet in 1 second? No. It's something that's a really big misconception. And what I mean by this is just because you take a step doesn't mean that your whole body's moving the same length. So whether it's a person or an animal, if you go to take a step, let's do an exaggerated step. So exaggerated step, my foot might be right here, but my body's here. And so you see I'm only moving, even with an exaggerated step, about 6 inches. So a normal step is just going to be this, and I'm only shifting between 2 and 3 inches. So if, let's go by the pie plate. So that seems to be everybody's favorite thing is the pie plate. Average deer vitals, depending on where you're at, but average deer vitals for the entire thing are about 10 to 12 inches. So a 10-inch plate is what a lot of guys categorize, especially for shooting down range, what their lethality is as far as what they can consistently shoot. So we're going to use that pie plate of, you've got a 10-inch plate. Well, if, let's say even you're aiming dead center, that deer takes a slight step forward, starts to move forward, you're only shifting so much. You shift 2 inches, you're still inside that vital cavity. That bullet is simply just going through a different point in the lungs, if you're aiming for the lungs. So what's going to happen is not only do you have that permanent wound cavity going through, just 2 inches off, 2-3 inches off to the right, but you also have the temporary wound cavity from, depending on impact velocity, hydraulic shock or hydrostatic shock. And if you look at ballistic tests, you're going to see that gelatin, and when the bullet goes in, it's going to do this crazy expansion, and that's the temporary wound cavity or hydraulic or hydrostatic shock. Now, once the gel stops, you have that permanent wound cavity left by the bullet that's going to stay there. Now, with that temporary wound cavity, let's say you have, it creates a 10-inch cavity. Well, even if you're 3 inches here, you have 2 inches of vitals left, that temporary wound cavity is going to open up to that 10 inches around that, covering most of those vitals and causing it to rupture. All that, rupture, break, whatever you want to call it, especially with hydraulic shock. Hydraulic shock happens at 2,200 feet per second or above. And what it is hydrostatic shock, 2,200 feet under, is where the best example I have is a rubber band. If you take a rubber band and you start stretching it in every direction until the fibers start to break, but it hasn't come apart yet, you haven't maxed out that elasticity point, that is hydrostatic shock. And what it does is it expands in there, it causes massive tissue damage, it causes stuff to rupture internally, and that's what you want. You want that energy dump into it. Now, over 2,200 feet per second, you have hydraulic shock. Now, what hydraulic shock is just a more powerful version, basically, to break it down Barney style. So you take that same rubber band and you stretch it beyond its elasticity point until it just breaks. If you ever shot a deer close range and went up and the vitals were just soup, just chunks, that's hydraulic shock. That is, again, if you can get it, that's ideal as far as turning that chest cavity to soup. Will a lower hydrostatic shock work, or even that just permanent wound cavity? Yes, it still will. The more damage you have, the faster it dies. That's another thing that's a common misconception, is that people want to save meat and say, hey, I want to cause less damage, you're causing too much damage, that's unethical. Well, ethical is resulting in a quick, clean kill within your abilities. So actually, damage is a positive thing. The more damage you make, the faster it dies. So it's one of those things, and you don't really lose as much meat as people think. I've even weighed out different sections to prove this to people, and max you're losing 2 or 3 pounds. I get guys all the time that say, hey, I go for saving as much meat as possible, as little damage. Well, those guys year after year end up with either wounded animals they can't find, long track jobs. So these guys lose deer every year, have long track jobs, and I go for causing as much damage as possible, and they drop dead on the spot most of the time. So it's one of those things that they can say whatever they want and call me unethical, but they're still trying to find their deer, and I have deer in the freezer. So, you know, do you. But back to the topic at hand. So you have that temporary wound cavity. So that does give you, it's called some wiggle room. And this is what a lot of people do with going to magnum calibers. And a lot of it is the person makes a bad shot or doesn't understand bullet construction and terminal ballistics, and so they blame the equipment. It couldn't be them. It's always the equipment. When in reality, 95% of the time, in my experience, it's operator error. And so what happens is they'll shoot it with a smaller caliber, and they say, oh, well, it's the caliber. And so they go get a big magnum. And a lot of times they can't, with recoil sensitivity, handle those big magnums. And what they're trying to do is that larger bullet at high impact is, with, again, the correct bullet choice, is going to open up a much larger temporary wound cavity. And so they're giving themselves, they're trying to, not cheat, but they're trying to give themselves more margin of error to make up for their lack of ability to place a shot and giving them that bigger wound cavity. So it's one of those things, a lot of people, I don't recommend going to magnums. Magnums are great if you can handle, but in reality, most people are too recoil sensitive to go to those. There's plenty of non-magnum calibers, if you actually study and learn terminal ballistics, bullet construction, that you can use just as effectively or even more than in a lot of cases, because you can more accurately put that round on target. So, but as far as movement wise, it doesn't matter if you're in archery hunting, long range, whatever, you watch deer movements. If I'm up in a tree stand and I'm archery hunting, what am I watching? Let's say whitetails. Whitetails tend to wiggle their tail before they lift their head. So if you're trying to draw on a deer and you're in that tree stand, you're watching that movement so you know when to draw. It's the same thing with long range hunting. Now, again, like I demonstrated, your body doesn't actually move as much as people think. And it's the same thing with deer. If you actually study them, how they move and watch them, deer don't, unless they take off running, do not take giant first steps. They generally are only moving maximum about 6 inches. They kind of do a prodding step and then they'll start. And a lot of times even when they start moving, they're going to take a step, look around, and then go. So it's one of those things that with that general prodding step with a deer, you're only looking maximum around a 3-inch deviation. And if you're doing what's called a high shoulder shot, that gives you even more margin for it to be on. But even if you're aiming dead center, that movement is still not going to take you outside that vital zone. So it's really not anything to quote unquote worry about. Because again, people exaggerate these flight times. Most of these shots are under a second. And again, even if that deer starts to step, the body itself, it takes a step. So my foot might be a foot in front of my body, but again, I'm not moving that much with that step. And neither is deer or any other animal. That first step, their legs moving, and it's causing a slight shift, but it's not as big as people think. Now, a high shoulder shot, because we've been discussing this too, is one of the most effective long range shots. Reason being, it drops them dead on the spot. Now, what that does is you are aiming for the flat piece of the shoulder up here. You're going to impact that. It's going to blow through that shoulder, hit the other shoulder. It's going to break both shoulders. And what it's going to do to the spine, pro deer hunters taking care of pest deer have actually done this in slow motion to study it and dissected them to study the anatomy and what it does. And it actually causes the spinal or the spine to flex, and it snaps the spinal cord, cutting all signals to the brain. So you have both shoulders broken. You have the spine has snapped, and it's cutting signals to the brain. And then also you have that bullet going through, causing that temporary wound cavity, the hydraulic shock or hydrostatic shock. You have the permanent wound cavity from that bullet. And then you also have the bone fragments from that leg going through like a grenade into those vitals. So it's just absolutely devastating. And because the signals are being cut to the brain, that animal is dead before it hits the ground. As soon as it hits the other shoulder, that thing is dead. So it's going to drop dead on the spot. You hear a lot of people say, oh, well, they edited footage or this. Animal, I've never had it one, drop dead on the spot. That doesn't mean that it's wrong. And they're just trying to argue with video evidence because it proves them wrong. So they try to make it up stuff like the deer stepping, stuff like that, to make it look bad because they see the evidence that it works. So it's one of those things, if you understand, even with heart shots, you can drop them on the spot. If you cause enough damage to shut down their central nervous system with that temporary wound cavity, you can put them basically in a coma while they bleed out. So it's one of those things that there's a lot of misunderstandings on this, but as far as the deer taking a step or, elk or whatever the animal is, especially on those bigger ones, again, those vitals get much larger, 12, 15 inches, and so it's giving you an even bigger margin of error. But even on the smaller animals like deer, a white-tailed deer, when it takes that step, you're only shifting a slight amount. And so, again, as long as you're getting that point of aim, point of impact, and even with your accuracy deviation, you can still be within that vital zone. So, again, we try to watch, catch them when they're bedded. I've done that. Catch them when they're eating. That's a really good shot because they tend not to move. And if they do, they'll just, maybe take a grazing step. But again, they don't just, unless something spooks them, they just don't take off bolting. And if you break that shot, and most distances, especially with the velocities that people are pushing these bullets, for long range hunting, because again, you want that speed to extend your supersonic range and, less wind, flight time, etc. It's really not going to get away. It can take that step or start off and you're still going to be inside the vital. So don't really worry about that and just basically ignore it. You can correct them and point it out, but most of those people don't even care about facts. You can point out all the facts and evidence in the world and they're just not going to believe you. But there's the other people that are watching and listening that might want to learn, and that's who you want to reach. So you might be arguing with this guy and you might seem pointless, but that's not the only person in that forum or in that Facebook group or in that gun shop or whatever the case might be, and you can help them by giving them correct information to become better and succeed. So it's one of those things that it doesn't matter if you're top end the best or you're a beginner. Everybody can learn something and everybody can share knowledge. It's one of those things that it gets irritating. New guys try to ask questions and nobody will give them a hand. They just want to, be jerks about it. And then, it's just one of those things that even the best learn new stuff all the time. The best in the world never stop learning. The day you stop learning is the day you failed. The best in the world are always trying to become better and achieve. So have that same mindset. Help out another hunter. Again, a lot of people put out a lot of bad information, and it's one of those things that you might not be able to change their mind by correcting it, but you can change somebody else's. So don't worry about that as much. Even if it's you that's going to take that shot, if you're worried about it taking a step, even if it starts to take a step, and again, study each animal and how it moves, reacts, like a whitetail, if it starts flicking its tail, it's about to lift its head, watch the ears, what it does. The ears all of a sudden fix on one point and it starts to raise its head, it's paying attention to something. Now, generally, when they do that, they're not going to take off running. They're going to try to figure out what it is. So that's another one that, even though they're on alert, that first second of alert, they're just trying to figure out what that other thing is and find out if do they need to run or can they stay. Could be another deer, could be a predator. So it's one of those things, just study animal behavior and learn your weapon, know your stuff. If you're inside those capabilities and that deer's feeding or just sitting there, go ahead and send that round. If it does take a step, guess what? It's still going to be inside the vital area. That temporary wound cavity, as long as you're using the correct bullet, is going to do its job. It's going to open up. It's going to cause stuff to rupture. Again, if you have enough velocity, you get that hydraulic shock. Guess what? It's going to turn the insides to soup. So either way, it doesn't matter if it stays there or if it takes a step, it's still a dead animal. So keep safe out there. Everybody, good luck. To the ones who've already succeeded so far this hunting season, congratulations. That's awesome. There's been some awesome shots. There's, one of our admins just shot a buck at 801 yards. We had a kid that dropped one at, I think it was 1,087 yards. Another new member just dropped one at just shy of, he dropped a mule deer just shy of 500 yards with a 6.5 Creedmoor, the ELD match bullet. And there's been quite a few others. Another member, Travis, just shot a really nice bull elk at 370 yards. So everybody's been going to town. As far as everybody else who either the season hasn't started or you simply haven't been successful yet, good luck. Really hope you get something, and happy hunting.